Welcome to our first Poolside Proficiency presentation of 2025. My name is Alexis Buschert, and I'm an instructional strategist with Wayside Publishing. We are so glad you are here. Today's session is about providing comprehensible input for students and explore some ways to encourage students to produce more target language. Remember that the content from this webinar is only part of the overall professional learning available for this topic. In addition to this recorded webinar, access the Poolside Proficiency document to find a related blog post, podcast episode, an opportunity to reflect and read reactions from other educators, and the link to register for the 2 live events that we will host this summer. Remember to also get credit for interacting with this content by requesting a professional learning certificate. Here are the goals for today's session. I can explain what comprehensible input is and why it is important. I can identify activities and/or strategies to use to provide comprehensible input for my students. I can envision how I will implement at least one new idea in my lessons. Be sure to visit the website shown here for more information and links to register for our upcoming live events. Take a moment and read this excerpt from Henshaw and Hawkins. We need to make sure we're not just providing target language noise to students, but language that is actually meaningful to them. Comprehensible input means that students can understand what is being communicated. Students should understand the message to make form-meaning connections that build a linguistic system in their head. In order for something to be input, students should understand the message and be able to process the target language they are receiving, whether that is through hearing or reading the language. Read this definition one more time. We're going to take a quick formative assessment. In this section, you will be presented with a situation. Ask yourself if this is providing comprehensible input for the student or not. There will be a pause for you to note your answer. Remember that in order for it to count, students need to be processing the source of language for meaning. So, are these following examples good instances of comprehensible input or not? Students are given 10 steps to a recipe, but in the wrong order. They are told to put the sentences in the correct order and finally guess what dish the recipe is for. Is this a good example of input for students? The answer for this one is yes. Students must be able to understand the steps in order to put them in the correct order and then decide what the recipe is for. In our next example, the teacher says in the target language, "Get up," and the students get up. Is this an example of good input for students? Yes, this is a good example of input because students' responses of standing up shows that they comprehend and process the message. Students read a dialogue between a waiter and a customer. Then they read the same dialogue in front of the class. Is this an example of input? No, This is not an example of input for students because students can read the dialogue and even present the dialogue to the class without understanding it at all or processing any of the meaning. The teacher plays a song and gives the students the lyrics, but with some of the words missing. Students fill in the blanks as they listen to the song. Is this an example of input? No, this is not an example of comprehensible input because students may not understand at all what they're hearing. They're just writing down what they hear. So they're not processing the message. It's just noise to them. The teacher says and writes a conjugated verb on the board. Students respond with the corresponding infinitive. Is this good comprehensible input? No, this is not a good example because students don't need to know any meaning of the conjugated verb to write the infinitive of it. Our last example, the teacher describes what their house looks like and shows 3 pictures of different houses. Students choose the picture that matches the description. Is this an example of input? Yes, this is a good example because students need to understand the message in order to choose the correct picture. So if they've chosen the correct picture, then it demonstrates to the teacher that they understood her message. Now take a moment to read this, also from Henshaw and Hawkins. The tasks we ask students to do need to be interesting and engaging to the students. They need to be at the appropriate level so that students can understand the message. And it's not just about input, it's about providing comprehensible input. Here's a visual to explain the input hypothesis. I represents the target language that students know. The I plus 0 represents language that they can understand or their current level of proficiency in the target language. I plus 2 in the outer circle represents target language that is most likely too challenging for students. This can be overwhelming because it is no longer comprehensible enough for students to make meaning. I plus 1 is where we want to live. This represents their current level of target language, but slightly more challenging. It is still comprehensible for students because they are able to make meaning, even if new words are included. When providing target language to students, whether you are speaking or presenting them with different resources of input, think about where that would fit in. By providing a reading that has only familiar words, that would be considered I plus 0, and students would not be acquiring new language. By turning on a TV show in the target language without any scaffolding or preparation, students would be overwhelmed and not acquire much of anything. That would be an example of I plus 2. But telling students a story where they know many of the words but are introduced to a few new words could be a good compromise in the middle, living in that I plus 1 space. Let's move on to some practical strategies that we can implement in our classrooms in the fall to provide quality, comprehensible input for students without adding a big lift for teachers. The first strategy we will explore is called tiered questioning. Tiered questioning is a great strategy to use for presenting vocabulary in context. You may have also heard this referred to as circling. This is a great strategy for differentiation because you can adjust the activity based on the level and needs of the students. Here's how it works. Start by making a statement to the class. Usually that statement is focused on a grammatical structure, vocabulary words, or phrases. Ask students to confirm that they understood your statement. Then ask students a yes question based on the statement and a no question based on the statement. Then move on to an either-or question where students are given two options and one of the options requires them to say the target word or phrase to answer. From there, you can move on to question word questions or longer open-ended questions that use an interrogative word. The final step in this process is to ask open-ended questions. This is also referred to as PQA or personal questions and answer. From here, students are given the opportunity to give longer, more open-ended answers based on the questions that the teacher asks. This cycle can be repeated over and over again for different target words and phrases. On the next slide, we'll look at an example of a script for tiered questioning. If this is your first time using tiered questioning, don't hesitate to write out a script to help you as you navigate through this process with your students. Let's look at an example script of an interaction between students and teacher using tiered questioning. The student responses are in italics. Taylor Swift is a singer. Is she a singer? Yes, she is a singer. Is she a painter? No, she's not a painter. She is a singer. Is she a singer or a painter? She is a singer. She is not a painter. Who is Taylor Swift? She is a singer. Who is your favorite singer? Let's look at another example from our pre-made flashcards. In this scenario, this image is on the board so that students can see, and I'm referencing the images in front of the classroom. First, I'm going to make a statement. Peter likes to play tennis. Students should indicate in some way that they understand. I can also use the images of the flashcard to indicate the image about which I am speaking. Then, for a yes/no question, I could ask, does Peter like to snowboard? The class should answer no. Then I ask, does Peter like to play tennis? The class should answer yes. For the either/or questions, I could ask, does Peter like to play tennis or hike? Here, I'm eliciting the word from students and they should say play tennis. Next, I want to ask a question using an interrogative. I could ask, what does Peter like to do? Finally, I could start to ask open-ended questions. Some refer to this as PQA or personal question and answer because I will start to ask members of the class about their preferences. For example, I could ask, who else likes to play tennis like Peter? The next strategy we will explore is called IRF repeat. IRF stands for Initiate, Response, Feedback. This is more advanced than tiered questioning and is more like a conversation between the teacher and students. In this strategy, the teacher initiates the interaction by asking a question. The student responds, then the teacher comments and asks a follow-up question. From here, the process can be repeated over and over again. Let's look at an example. To initiate the conversation, I would say something like, do you like to swim? Then the response would be, yes, I like to swim. Now, as the teacher, I provide feedback. That's cool you like to swim. Where do you like to swim? Other questions that I could use for feedback in this situation would be, who do you like to swim with? Who else in your family likes to swim? Do you like to swim in a pool or a lake? A few things that I would like to point out here. Notice the number of repetitions of the language structure like to swim. There are several references here. This is a great way to have students get a feel for the grammar structures. This is better for acquisition of the structures versus memorization of the rules. We talk in language about how students learn if things sound right or not. but we can't teach them what sounds right without enough input of that particular structure. The next strategy that we will explore to provide comprehensible input to students is calendar talk. Calendar talk is a strategy to use at the beginning of class every day. This isn't just for beginners to talk about days of the week. There are so many extensions for all different levels of learners. Go beyond the calendar and talk about weather, upcoming school events, holidays, important events out in the world, and ask students their opinion on what's happening around them. Let's explore some examples for novice and intermediate level classrooms. Here's an example of a calendar talk script for a novice classroom. One prompt could focus on days of the week. What day of the week is it? What day was yesterday? What day is tomorrow? This is great for reviewing newly learned vocabulary. You could also talk about the date. What is the date today? Does anyone have a birthday today? So this is reinforcing talking about numbers and months. What season are we in? What is the weather like today? What are you wearing because of the weather? So this can talk about seasons, where you live, what the weather's like in different seasons where you live. And also, if you've been talking about clothing with your classroom, with your students, this is a great opportunity to dive more into examples with the clothing. Is there anything special happening at school today? What is it? Are you participating? This can shift the focus from your classroom out into the school. So maybe there's a club that has some kind of performance after school that day. That gives any students in the class that are part of that club an opportunity to talk about it and invite other students. So when first starting with calendar talk, it's helpful to write a short script just like this ahead of time to remind yourself what you're covering and where you're going. But this is by no means a fixed script. Use the student responses to guide the conversation. So if there's a birthday in the classroom, you could guide that student to talk more about their birthday. If there's a big weather event approaching, consider going off on a tangent. While this is a great time to review vocabulary that students have already learned, it's also an important opportunity to insert new high interest vocabulary as it comes up and it's relevant. For example, maybe there's a big storm predicted for later in the week. You could introduce some vocabulary to talk about the storm, ask students how they feel about it, and how one should prepare for a weather event like that. As new phrases arise, write them on the board and refer to them multiple times. Remember that this is also a great time to bring in input using target grammatical structures. Incorporate the phrases that students are working to acquire. You can use any verb tenses that make sense for the conversation. Here are some examples for using this activity with upper level classes. If you want to keep the conversation about school, you could ask, what's going on this week at school? And give them some ideas like events, tests, projects for certain classes, important games coming up for sports, assemblies, etc. You could also bring it out into the community. What's going on in our community? Is there a significant event that's coming up soon? Maybe your town has some type of celebration that they do at a certain time of year. You could also bring this out to a more global perspective. Do we have any big holidays coming up? What about in Spanish-speaking countries? Are there holidays approaching there? Do we have similar events in our community? That's asking for some connections and comparisons that students can make between their own culture and the target culture. As with the last example for novice classes, use these conversations as opportunities to expand on a familiar topic to bring in more relevant and high-interest vocabulary. With more advanced students, these discussions allow for cultural connections and comparisons. So for example, if asking some of these questions in September, bring up Mexican Independence Day in a Spanish class. Find a short video to show a celebration of that holiday in Mexico and ask students to compare it to the 4th of July in the United States. What are some similarities? What are some differences? This could even lead to a bigger discussion about how each country sought its independence and from who. Again, if starting out with calendar talk for the first time, Consider making a list of questions or ideas ahead of time to guide your conversation. If students are quiet at first and don't contribute much, make the questions more simple, give them options for answers, or even take an informal poll about their opinions on a topic. Remember that simple sentence frames can also help students get started and voice their opinions. The next strategy that we will explore is called picture talk. In this next strategy, the teacher is leading a guided conversation with students about an image. The image can be culturally relevant, like this one that we see here, from a market in a Spanish-speaking country. Choose an image that is related to what you are currently talking about in class with students so that they can have some vocabulary and context to get started. Before starting the conversation, select some words, phrases, and/or grammatical structures that act as the focus content for this discussion. These can be written on the board as they come up, and they should be referenced several times in the conversation. Don't shy away if other words and phrases come up during the conversation. Just like with calendar talk, this activity can be used to bring in more relevant and high-interest vocabulary that may not occur in class otherwise. For example, if you are trying to guide students' attention to one aspect of the picture, but students keep asking about specific food items they're seeing in the photo, go with that. Describe the food to them. If none of you know what it is, open a separate tab and search for it. Use that as an opportunity to make a simple cultural connection or comparison. Do we eat something similar to this in our community? As with calendar talk, it can be helpful to think of questions and a script ahead of time. Let's look at an example. Here's an example of a script for a teacher that they've written for themselves to help them walk through a picture talk with their students. Here, the teacher has decided on key words and phrases that will be the focus of the discussion for the picture that we just saw. Those words are market and candy. The structures are the verb wants plus to buy and to eat. The teacher's goal is to use these words and phrases in context as many times as possible during the discussion. The following are sentences and questions that the teacher can use to help students process the image in the target language and lead to further discussion. For the first bullet point, the man wants to buy something. So there I've used want and to buy together. Does he want to buy something at Walmart? Does he want to buy something at Walmart or at a market? So in this example, my discussion is going to head more towards what's the difference between a market and where my students might buy candy or something like that in the United States, or what's in our community where students would go to buy these types of things. In this second example, it says he wants to buy candy at the market. Does he want to buy fruit or candy at the market? In this context, we might head more into talking about markets in other countries and what kind of foods or products are available at those markets. And this could lead to a bigger discussion of, yes, we're seeing fruits here, or we're seeing candy here, but in other parts of the market, they might sell fruit or vegetables or meats or maybe even clothes. So that could lead to a bigger discussion about markets in other countries. And the next question, or the next topic, it says, there is a man and a woman. Who wants to eat candy? Does the man want to eat candy or does the woman want to eat candy? Here, we're asking students to make some inferences or educated guesses, and they can kind of build a story from there. And the last one, it says, does that person want to eat a lot of candy or a little candy? So looking at the photo, the students can make guesses and go from there based on what they're seeing. There's a few options where you can go, starting with some of these ideas that you see here. So the idea is creating a short story around the image, and maybe the teacher already has an idea of where they want that story to go. And so in that case, the teacher would be asking more leading questions to lead students into that short story. On the other hand, the students can help create the story as they go based on the responses that they give and the questions that they ask about the picture. Remember that the main idea of doing picture talk is to provide lots of repetition with the vocabulary, phrases, and or grammar structures that are important. And in this case, we've got those listed at the top. Today we looked at tiered questioning, IRF or Initiate Response Feedback, calendar talk, and picture talk. Which ones do you already do? Which would you like to try? If you are trying one of these for the first time, consider writing a script to follow. This will help you know what to say when using one of these strategies with your classes for the first time. Once you get the hang of it, these strategies actually require less planning because you will be able to generate the scripts in the moment off the top of your head and respond to what students say. Let's check back in with our objectives for this session. Can you explain what comprehensible input is and why it is important? Can you identify activities and or strategies to use to provide comprehensible input for students? Can you envision how you will implement at least one new idea in your lesson? Hopefully, you are walking away with some useful ideas that you feel ready to put into action in the fall. Remember to check out the rest of the resources available on the document where you found this webinar recording. One of the resources is a Canva whiteboard where you can share your ideas and reflections about this topic and read what other educators like you have posted. To find information about live events that go with the 2025 Poolside Proficiency series and to access future asynchronous content, be sure to visit the link on the screen. Thank you so much for joining us today. To receive a certificate for this professional learning opportunity, scan the QR code that you see here. This will take you to a form. Once you've filled out the form, you will receive an email with a link to register for live events for this summer. Again, thank you for joining us for Poolside Proficiency. From all of us here at Wayside Publishing, we wish you a relaxing summer.